Okay, I think I'm gonna get started. If everyone, can you hear me? Am I good? Okay. Well, first of all, welcome. It's such a pleasure to see all of you. Thank you so much for coming out. I am Lisa Melandri. I'm the executive director here at CAM, but I am very, very honored, privileged, and moved to also be the curator of Salvatore Scarpitta Racing Cars. This is an exhibition that has been sort of in my mind and in planning stages off and on for a really long time, almost a decade. And it's because Sal, as an artist, is someone who has deeply moved me for being someone who has forged his own path, someone who was never part of any particular movement, someone who's very under-recognized. And this particular body of work that's in this exhibition is very, very important, not just to me from an art historical perspective, but it was very, very important to him. So just to give you a little bit of a sense of this, Sal had a very, very long career as an artist that was marked by an incredibly broad range of production. He made, as I said, singular and innovative work throughout his, half a century career of art making. And so this show really only gives us one view into his passion for, his interest in, and his inspiration from racing and race cars and cars in general. And the reason that this is the case is that Sal became deeply inspired by and influenced by racing cars and racing car drivers as a kid. It was a childhood passion, but it was also the only part of his entire production as an artist that he started thinking about at the age of 11 and finished making work about in the very, very last years of his life. So even though it's one incisive view, it bridges the entirety of his creative career. Because it sort of starts in his childhood, biography is really important to understanding who he was as an artist. And so that's where I always like to start. Sal was born in New York City in 1919. His father was a Sicilian immigrant and was a sculptor of some note. He had a reputation as a sculptor, but by 1930 he had moved the family to Los Angeles to not only continue his artistic practice, but because he had great work doing sets and props within the movie industry. Sal's Russian mom was also someone who dabbled in acting, and this is just kind of an aside because Sal's sister became rather a kind of bombshell ingenue as an actress in Italy, actually, at the same time that he was kind of burgeoning as an artist. So LA was the right place for them on many different levels. And they moved into Hollywood, and within, minutes of unpacking, Sal found the Legion Ascot Speedway, which was a dirt oval track right around the corner from his house. And he then proceeded to spend a lot of time there. He would have seen races very much like what you're seeing here. This is the kind of dirt track racing, this open wheel racing from the 20s and into the early 30s. He was riveted by this kind of racing, by these cars and by these drivers. He talked very much about how this idea that they were rough and tumble, that it was scrappy, that there was incredible danger involved, that there was pure courage evidenced by these drivers. They were out in the elements. There was no safety equipment to speak of. They were wearing those leather non-helmets and the goggles. They had to wipe the dust and the mud from their eyes as they were racing in order to even see. And so these drivers held a kind of mythic fascination for Scarpitta as a kid. And I just want to point out on the far right is Radio Jack. So a lot of these guys, as today, became drivers of note. They competed on a ton of different circuits across the United States. And Ranger Jack was of particular note to Sal because he was one of the only and the first African-American drivers who was driving in this circuit. He was, by all accounts, totally thrilling to watch. His style was supposedly amazing, but he was also a trailblazer and a hero in and of himself. And this burned itself into Sal's brain and really would be the entire genesis of the car works that he would start to do in the 1960s. So this is just, I always like to put this in, this is Sal at the age of 14 depicting one of the deadly crashes at the Speedway. You know, as I say, this sport was lethal at this time and given the equipment that it was. And when Sal would speak about it, he didn't speak about it from a kind of prurient, you know, I want to see the crash kind of, for that sort of quality, but instead he spoke about the fact that these drivers were incredible risk takers, and it was because they were so deeply driven by their passions and their love for these cars and this racing, that they would do it even knowing what could befall them. He also later discussed this kind of racing as truly and distinctly American. You know, in fact, you don't really see in European racing these kind of dirt tracks or these ovals. The cars are set up differently, the engines, the weighting, the horsepower, all of that is very different. You know, it's often talked about that this dirt track racing comes from our American horse track roots, that these same tracks that you would use for horse racing were later transformed into spaces for automobiles. It's also been said that Americans got really good during Prohibition at running hooch on unpaved roads at breakneck speeds. How much of this is real and how much of it is myth doesn't really matter, but it fuels this romantic idea of American grit and ingenuity and that bit of lawlessness, which is also synonymous with Americanness in this idea. So Sal left America as a young man as soon as he finished Hollywood High. He was interested in becoming an artist. He knew that that's what he wanted for a profession. And he went to Italy because he wanted to understand his father's roots and background. And then he enrolled in the Academy in Rome. And what you see here is exactly what you might expect from an Academy artist. He was considered very successful among his peers. He had great facility and ability, and he was kind of learning. He was figuring out who he was. But while he was in Italy, World War II erupted around him. He had seen the buildup of the war and the kind of injustices inherent in the policies and the personage of the fascist Mussolini. Even as a young man, Sal had been a rather radical-leaning, politicized person. And his first attempt at getting involved was that he actually wanted to join the partigiani, which were, you know, the Italian resistance fighters. You know, as this American in Rome, this sort of expat, a pretty interesting choice. When the U.S. entered the war, he, as a U.S. citizen, decided that he would instead join the United States Navy, which he did. So it's here in this kind of story of his life and who he is that this kind of persona begins to emerge around him. He had a big personality from the earliest accounts of who he was. This is something you hear again and again. And he, too, was indeed a risk taker and was very courageous. And you begin to see this through his kind of wartime exploits on the part of good, if you will. He even becomes a monuments man, which is kind of, you know, the stuff of movies, finding and saving artworks that were looted by the Nazis. And even here, we really see this idea as art as primary, as, you know, an artist who prioritizes art as the evidence of a good and a just and a healthy society. Once the war was over, he elects to stay in Rome, and he became a part of a dramatically changing art world. So all around him at this time, artists were adopting a brand new formal language. They were responding to the horrors of war through the use of a brand new and abstract but yet visceral vocabulary. Artists were destroying the canvas. Burri and Fontana were tearing, sewing, punching holes in the picture plane. Manzoni and Maccarelli were investigating the monochrome, but with different attention both to the surface disruption and to the ruined rather than the pristine. Scarpitta was no different. By the mid-1950s, he had completely abandoned what we saw him doing when he was in the academy. He had abandoned this figurative work and instead had codified a brand new abstract language that was all his own. He was taking painting frames and wrapping them with found textiles, bandages, and then setting them with binders and resin. And this, too, like we see in the works of somebody like Buri, was very much about thinking about wounds and healing, right? It's all about this kind of aftermath of war. But the works are also, I think, really interesting amongst his compatriots because he's pushing the boundaries of a two-dimensional painting, he was still calling them paintings, quite far. And you end up with works that have an almost bas-relief quality, even more so than people like Fontana and Buri, etc. From these images, you can also see this great picture of him with this incredible piece, Moby Dick, in his studio, and you can also see the extraordinary scale, the monumentality on which he is working, and thinking about how these works are constructed. And Moby Dick is a really, really fascinating work because it's clearly deeply engaged with this European miasma post-war, but Scarpitta nonetheless looks to his American heritage in the titling of the work to allude to the ultimate nemesis, right? The white whale and the battle of violence that surrounds that protagonist. So this kind of in-betweenness, this consistent look to America is something that we see even in these years when he's deeply ensconced in Rome. Now, when I say deeply ensconced in Rome, the thing that was really incredible is that he had made his way to the kind of center of the art world there. He was showing with the most famous, most important avant-garde gallery, La Tartaruga at that point. He was one of the real players in this exciting transformational moment. And along with the Italians and his compatriots from that area, there began to also be a significant influx of American artists who were coming to Rome, going back into the Academy in the early 50s. Certainly Robert Rauschenberg was one of them, and Scarpitta's studio on the Via Margutta was right next door to that of Cy Twombly. This is a show. Boy, if you could have a teleporter and go back and see this show, I'd want to see this show. In 1959 at La Tartaruga, they mounted an exhibition that included Scarpitta, Franz Klein, Mark Rothko, and Cy Twombly. So you're really getting a sense that this is it, right? This is this kind of epicenter of the most avant-garde in the art world. And so it's no wonder that as a real kind of figure within this, that Leo Castelli found Sal along the way. He had seen him work in the studio. He had seen some of these exhibitions. He became enamored of Sal's practice, and he offered him a place not only at the Castelli Gallery in New York, but he suggested that perhaps it was time for Sal to come home, to return to the United States. Sal talked later about the fact that even though things were going incredibly well for him as an artist, that he was struggling with living in Europe. He was struggling with this aftermath of the war, that it hung around him. It made him feel mired. He was looking at, the kind of ruined infrastructure of certain parts of Rome that had not yet rebuilt, and that it was difficult, and he felt stuck. So in 1959, he accepted Castelli's offer, and he headed for the United States. Now, here's a little reprieve and a reminder. Cars were always lurking in the mind of Sal, regardless what it was that he was doing. So even while he was engaged in totally abstract painting practices, along with, all of his cohort, he continued to sort of draw and sketch on his own. And interestingly, the vast majority of this part of his production was like motorcycles and police cars and cars that he was seeing in Rome. This is a work that we're incredibly lucky to have in our exhibition because it's from 1952, it's really early. And the funny thing about it is he made this as the exhibition announcement for one of his shows at Galleria Tartaruga. And so you got this exhibition announcement, and then you saw it as a flyer, and then you walked in the gallery and you'd see Moby Dick. So it's just there to keep in mind that these things, these motor vehicles, this kind of way of moving through space and thinking about the machine was never far from him, no matter what he was doing. So 1959, he's back in the States. and settled in New York City, and he even had his first solo show at Leo Castelli. And again, I think it's a really important thing to think about who Leo Castelli was, and what that meant for an artist like Sal. So Castelli offered a completely new model for a commercial gallery. He would take on his artists not just as a dealer, but as a true supporter, as a mentor. He built lifelong relationships with his artists. And he was known as a dealer who would give his artists a living wage. He would give them what constituted a salary. And this was so that they would be free to create and to innovate and to produce without the struggles necessary to make a living. Sal, from the very beginning, saw Leo not as a dealer, but as a father figure, as a family member, as a partner. He was grateful, but also really personally attached to Leo. And he thought of him as a steadfast patron, but also a person who cared deeply about his creative output. And in fact, they would work together for 40 years. And being part of Castelli also meant that Sal was even more ensconced in now what was a who's who of American art and American art history. And you look at this picture of this 25th lunch anniversary, I mean, aside from the fact that you'll notice that there's like only one lady and probably someone you've never heard of, but that's a whole other lecture for another time. Other than that, it's a pretty unbelievable situation. And if you look at these people, they were in this together, and they talk about the fact that these were social relationships as well as a gallery relationship. So in addition to working with the kind of luminaries of the art world, Sal was associating with the pop artists, with the abstract expressionists. He hung out with Philip Guston, Willem de Kooning, David Smith, and everybody says, to a one, that it was extraordinarily pleasurable to spend time and talk to Sal. Not only this sense of personality and welcome and the kind of grandness of who he was, but the fact that he was someone who was a great conversationalist about art and the meaning of art and what art was. And then also, he'd never really lost his kind of radical political leanings. At the same time that he, would talk about how extraordinary America was, he was espousing communism. And he was basically always looking to back the thing that wasn't the norm. This, I think, is also something that helps us understand who he was. And once we get into the cars, really helps us sort of understand what that work was for him. Even at the center of this art world, he didn't exactly fit. So he hung out with both the abstract expressionists and the pop artists, but he wasn't an abstract expressionist or a pop artist. His work was something kind of in between. He played and dabbled on the fringes of all different movements, never really subscribing to any particular ism. And, he was never on one art team, if you will. So during this time, he continues to make work that pushes the very definition of painting and of the two-dimensional canvas. In addition to the bandages and rags that he had used before, he starts using materials that spoke of machines, particularly cars, and this is called racer's pillow, so that's a really, that's a chance to sort of think about what that might mean. So they include belts, they include people's belts, but they also include safety belts. They include military tarps. They include the canvas covers that you might think of, as in a Jeep convoy. They include travel pillows. They include rubber sheeting. And then these metal elements, which come into the work mostly during this juncture, are reminiscent both of the pipes and the tubing that you see on race cars, but also of tent poles. And I think that there's something really interesting about this idea of an itinerant work of art, right? Something that's engaged with moving. And he continues to be even more of what I might call a physical maker of objects, kind of an action artist. He stretched and pulled. He uses his body, his own body's force in the creation of these things. He's also a constructor and a tinkerer, and all of this really does find its apotheosis in the race cars. So then it happened. So This is a very, very thrilling moment in the early 1960s. Suddenly, in the midst of all of this, Sal reached back into his memory. He thought about his passions and influences from childhood. Around him, artists like Warhol and Rauschenberg and Johns were making work that was about America, about its icons, about its symbols, about both its shiny possibilities and its failed promises. And Scarpitta said that he really embarked upon the making of race cars because, quote, I wanted to show that I too knew something of America. So the idea that these race cars are synonymous with, America, capital A. So he began building, assembling, and piecing together Ray Joe Jack Special. You remember Ray Joe Jack from our very first slide, and Ray Joe Jack stood for Sal as an emblem of courage, of breaking down barriers. And this car, which took him more than a year to make, was a perfect replica of those same open-wheel dirt track racers that Scarpitta had seen with his own eyes as a kid. It was not functional, no working engine, but it appeared to be that perfect model of what Ray Joe Jack would have driven. Unlike the pop artists who worked with contemporary images and found objects, Sal was looking back. He was looking to a different time. His America was from a different era. It was a time for him that had become mythically romantic, heroic. So this car ends up not only being an homage to Ray Joe Jack, but it's an homage to that American spirit of ingenuity and grit, which was the thing that had drawn him to that kind of racing to begin with. And here I just want to show you Ray Joe Jack as it lives today. And what's really interesting about this, it's in the Modern Art Museum in Torino. And you see here the addition of these gas pumps and the garage door. Well, just a sort of flight and something to think about with regard to the way that Scarpitta looked at these objects and thought about their context. Those were not part of the original work, and in fact, he added those to the piece when it was bought by the museum because he felt that it needed more of a kind of, that the machine itself needed a throne, it needed its own kind of room, and so he expanded this, and it's a little anachronistic, right, because it's not necessarily that those pumps are from the same period, et cetera. And so you see this kind of time shifting, this time traveling that he does with these machines that bring them back and forth between eras, and that's something that will show up again and again. And about the same time that he was constructing the cars, he began to construct his own image. He became the race car driver, like capital R, capital C, capital D. He started dressing the part. He would walk around all the time with one of those little leather helmets and sometimes even the goggles that the 1930s drivers wore. He documented this costume not only in photographs of him, but in these prints and collages and drawings and paintings. He put himself often at the literal center of these compositions, surrounded not only by cars and images of the cars, but the kind of sponsors and the stickers and the vendor information. He was placing himself in the role. So there's already, at this very early period, a quite intentional shift towards the performative and towards a kind of cult of personality that he was creating as an artist that was actually just as important as the objects themselves. Here again, you're going to start to see this very sort of funny, often with a great sense of humor, conflation between the 30s and the 60s, between contemporary time and contemporary art, and these heroes from the past. So these are two beauties from the 1960s that we are lucky enough to have in the exhibition. On the left, Sal Heist Rail Duster, and on the right, Sal's Red Holler Special. So here too, it's really interesting to think about what was important to him in terms of authenticity and the replica versus what was really a kind of stylized whim. One thing about his own persona is, even though they're based on 1930s models, first and foremost, Sal's in every one of them, whether it's the name that he sticks himself in there and emblazons it across the side, whether it's somewhere on there that he puts himself, he literally attaches himself to the chassis of this car. And he also is very clear that these are artworks. So even though he's making these cars and they're supposed to look like cars, and they have an historical precedent, he's showing them at Castelli. He's making sure that you see them in the white cube, right? That they have the context of what a high art piece could be. And he never wavers from that, particularly at the beginning. It's very important to him to make sure that you know that, yes, it's a car, but this is art and it's art first. The other thing that's just really wonderful is that Leo Castelli appears on every car. Starting at the very beginning, so it's not just Leo Castelli as a sponsor, but the word gallery, the word art, these things are always in there. And that's another way in which he insists that we're talking about artworks as much as we are talking about cars. Red Holler Special, the little one, is a replica of a midget racer, also based on kind of a 1930s, 1940s model. These are smaller scale cars. I mean, supposedly really, really interesting because back in, these older periods in the 30s and 40s, even though the chassis is like a kind of squished chassis, they have just as much horsepower as the big ones, so they were flyers. But here, he paints the driver on the side, also not particularly unusual, but in this case it's Jean-Christophe Castelli, who was Leo Castelli's son and would have been 2 years old at the time. So here too, this idea of the toy car, the idea of the performative gesture, who is the driver, what is the gift, how do you, represent what these cars are, so I think that's so charming. Car parts become their own sculptures. Both of these noses become separated from the chassis and are put on the wall. He used these parts in many cases as a kind of both antidote and foil to minimalist sculpture. They belie their actual function and become something that's ambiguous and industrial, speaking to a kind of an American consumer sensibility. And the other thing that's really nice about them is outside of this sort of conceptual envelope, you also really are getting a sense of the fact that Sal believes that these cars are absolutely beautiful, that they are beautiful holistically, they are beautiful as working machines, but they're so beautiful that every little gear and part and edge and piece holds its own on the wall. And I think that's something that's really kind of wonderful to think about. They also have an incredible promise of power. And we see that really, really clearly and really beautifully in the Sal Creager, which we're also very lucky to have in this exhibition. This was the only car that Sal made in its raw form, if you will, that he didn't, put a paint job on or decorate in any way. And he made the work to expose the bones of the machine. He talks about also these very anthropomorphic qualities of these cars, that each of them has a character, has a life. And he said that Sal Creager, with no decoration or distraction, is like a raw prehistoric creature. This very, very over-the-top way to talk about these machines, but it really does give you a sense of how he's looking at them from their mechanical point of view, from their functional point of view, from their aesthetic point of view, and for that thing, that ineffable thing that caught him when he was 11 years old and never let him go. So this is a wonderful, wonderful image that I love. It's him in his studio, and he's put on his helmet for you, and there he is surrounded by these cars, and it's a really, really wonderful also way to think about sort of the obsessive making that was happening at this time. He made 7 full-scale cars during the 60s. He started with Ranger Jack in 63. I mean, it was extraordinary production, but I do also want to go back to this idea that he was a little bit neither fish nor fowl in terms of the art world. And one of the things that begins now, early in his career, is the fact that all his cohort at Castelli were getting more and more famous, and were getting more and more wealthy, and were having their work in more and more collections all across the United States and all across the world. And Sal's in-betweenness actually shows up in really practical ways as well. It was evidenced in his market. And I think this is a really important point to think about, because I suspect that part of the reason that this work, Sal in general, but this work in particular, is still relatively under-recognized is because I think that many people in the art world don't know what to make of it. We can't exactly understand whether it's model or replica or conceptual work. And again, he forged this path in a very distinct and individualized way, which was a wonderful thing, but it was also the thing that kept him from mass recognition or, an incredible market, et cetera. It's this fringiness, and I think it's because these are works in and of themselves that are in between. They're in between their function as an artwork and their function as an object. But just to bring us back to the really good stuff, this is one of my favorite things. This is a Harper's Bazaar spread, and Sal is right in there, with Donald Judd and Ellsworth Kelly, so not to think for 1 minute that even though this work was a bit fringe, that he was not welcomed as the very center of the art world. And I think that this is also a very interesting point. I never met Sal. It's one of the sad things, I think, in my artistic career, because I think I would have enjoyed him tremendously. But the stories about him and who he was as a person are as important to everyone who talks about him as the work that he made, right? So that there's this conflation of who he was as a human being and who he was as an artist. And I think that a lot of this early success was really driven by the fascinating nature of who the man was. And he was able to use a lot of that, I think, to his advantage in his relationships. I think it was something that made his relationship with Castelli so long and so important. But again, the difference between being in Harper's and being able to support yourself on the sale of your artwork and be, lauded and critically acclaimed in that moment in contemporary society are two different things. Isn't this amazing, though? It's just extraordinary. Anyway. But Sal was undaunted. And this is another thing that has been, I think, very inspirational as an artist who, we'll talk about a little bit later, had gone on to teach. And he was undaunted because he believed in his own path and his own making. And so in the 70s, after he had completed all of these cars in the 60s, he then began to think a lot about their presentation and their display, and new ways to be able to see them, and new contexts for them. In the 1972 Biennale in Venice, he pushed this idea of performance a step further, holding a pretend race between two cars. So the Rail Duster and the Ernie Triplet Special were parked in San Marco's, Piazza San Marco. Neither of these cars had engines, neither of them functioned, but when they sat in the piazza side by side, it was like they were on show, which is something that you do either before or after a race. So it's also in this context where we first see the blurring of what the cars look like and what they can do. In this context, passersby could mistake these sculptures for the real thing, right? Yeah, they thought they were probably looking at classic cars in Piazza San Marco. So when out of the gallery, and in this new kind of context, Scarpitta was purposefully thinking about an ambiguity and a slippage in the definition of art and in the reception of what these objects were for the viewer. 1985 marks an extraordinary shift once again. This particular car, the Trevis, which is also a beauty, and we are very lucky to have it here, is an actual Spring Cup car that was used on the track. Same kind of racing from the 30s, but just the contemporary version of the dirt oval racing. Sal continued to adore the dirt track. So now, even though he's bringing it up to his own sort of contemporary time, he's still enamored by the kind of drivers and mechanics and team owners that raced on the dirt tracks. And he still thinks of this as like a quintessentially kind of American rough and tumble milieu. So this particular car was on the racetrack. It was driven by a driver named Greg O'Neill on the Mid-Atlantic Circuit. And in this case, Scarpitta just simply bought the car from him. So this is an ultimate ready-made in that way. He didn't construct it, he didn't build it, he just took the car, took it off the racetrack, and recontextualized it in the gallery. But he did customize it, and he made it incredibly specific to him in a way that only Sal could have done. Castelli's on there as a sponsor, as he had been in the earlier, but so is every member of Sal's family, candy bars, his dog Vito's favorite food, and the part which you can't see in this particular image of it, but you will have to go in the galleries and look at, which I think is the most kind of incredible surprise of this work, aside from the stake on the front that says the prime rib, is that the wing has a picture of 3 Mile Island nuclear plant on it with this incredible kind of ominous lightning bolt through it. So this is not your usual paint job for a Sprint Cup car, right? From the personal to the downright silly to the illustration of 1980s nuclear anxiety, clearly we are looking at a different kind of racer and a different kind of artist who's using the car as a billboard for all different kinds of pop culture and personal references. So this was a show car, bought from someone, taken off the track, stuck in the gallery, redecorated, if you will, and it was the sign of what would come next. This was the beginning. It was the thing that you could look at to think, what would a car look like if it was on the racing team of Sal Scarpitta? And within 2 years, everybody would know. By the mid-1980s, Sal was a team owner. And all the drivers who raced for him raced the number 59, which was this year that Sal found America again. Sal had by now relocated to Maryland, and he was teaching at MICA and was there for quite some time and was a truly beloved professor of art, not for the least of which the fact that he was always kind of mentoring students to believe in their own trajectories, into going ahead with bodies of work that might not necessarily be popular or fit in, and to, follow their passions, listen to their influences and inspirations. But the interesting thing is, even though he was a dedicated professor and he was still working with Leo Castelli, everyone says he was working and selling art to feed and fund his racing habit. His team raced all over the Mid-Atlantic and Eastern Circuit, so Lincoln Speedway, Abbottstown, Pennsylvania, Williams Grove Speedway in Pennsylvania, Hagerstown, Maryland, Pista, Maryland. I mean, really, 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 down and dirty in the dirt in the Mid-Atlantic region, all in these dusty, muddy circuits that he had sort of thought of in his dreams and in his mind, and now he was really in it. But now, as much as he was doing the practical part of racing, it was also an extraordinary shift in his practice as an artist, because now there was a total conflation between art and life. Now, I would say that this was a completely conceptual and performative body of work. Also, Sal always had quite a sense of humor. And so you see Castelli and Castelli art emblazoned on all the cars. The story I've told everyone, like ad nauseum, because I think it's so hysterical, is that when he was racing one of the number 59 cars and it just said art on the top, and everybody thought that that was the name of the driver. He played with all of this. It was not lost on him that, Castelli was this well-heeled, well-dressed, soft-spoken, elegant, one of the most successful gallerists in the whole world, and his name was emblazoned on this mud runner. He spoke about his gallerist and his sponsor in the same way. Both a gallerist and a sponsor created the environment in which a creative person could produce. Wins or paintings didn't necessarily matter. And these are just some wonderful pictures of him on the track, of the car on the track, and you see a whole number of different drivers. And I'd just like to perhaps put even a finer point on the fact that when we have seen this work by Sal Scarpitta and people have talked about it, certainly the car piece of it is so quintessentially important to him. And it was such a huge part of his production. But you really don't hear people speaking about it from this kind of performative lens. And I think that part of that was also because critically, just the way maybe people weren't really sure what those cars were, they weren't sure what category to put them in, that also with regard to the racing, was this a serious artistic pursuit, or was it sort of an act of bravado, a childhood obsession that was brought to life, he wanted to go and have fun and he just loved this. And so I think there's a little bit of that in the way that this work was sort of talked about and the reception for it. And I just want to read you this kind of hysterical and wonderful headline to give you a sense, because it is true. Sal loved this. It was an extraordinary passion. But I don't believe for a second that he wasn't absolutely cognizant of where and how this sort of practice fit within an art world, within a conceptual artwork, this kind of Gesamtkunstwerk, So this poster for a show in 1986, at the Aubenbach Gallery, the curator proclaims on this, just to give you a sense of the heightened language, this race car is competing for real. It is on its 49th race, 10 wrecks and 1 victory. This is Sal's idea of total art. So again, this almost manifesto-like way of describing this practice as a part of the art world and as essential to the art world. Meanwhile. It's just so fabulous. You can see there in the one on the right, it's a lot of years later, he's still wearing that helmet. So Sal, too, was very knowledgeable about the art world. He'd gone off in his own direction, but it wasn't that he was uneducated and unclear on what was happening around him. And he was very thoughtful about the way that he moved back and forth between the track and the gallery. So he documented his races and he documented the wrecks. The footage became an integral part of his exhibitions, and the objects that were left over, the car parts, the broken wings, the crashed noses, the crumpled car seats, become the traces of performance. And we can really think about the context for this in terms of the same way we might think about the Anna Mendieta, thoughtfully taken photographs post-performance, or Al Rupersberg's kind of twigs and detritus in a vitrine from Al's Cafe, or even the dirt from Alan Capro's 3-year project Trading Dirt, right? This is not terribly dissimilar to that kind of tracing of performance and action. And well into the 80s and 90s, he continues to think about who he is in this, what kind of protagonist he is, and to cast himself in ever more present ways, and that these things become the artwork. He made parallels between art making and racing incredibly clear. One of his films, this is from Sal as Racer, which is in the galleries, and again, there is a certain over-the-topness, let's be clear, but it too is about a kind of forced connection to who you are as the maker and what racing is as the sport or the endeavor. In another one of the films, it's called Letter to Castelli, and it couldn't be any more clear. In it, he's taking the camera around the kind of pits, getting ready for a race, and talking to Castelli about what a beautiful thing they've made. And this is the driver, and we won the last race, and we feel that we can get on pole position. It's just laid bare this kind of sense of how he was working within the structures of a traditional high art world and inserting this kind of performative, more pop activity within it. And the very latest works from our show from the late 80s and the early 90s are the race car driver portraits. And part of the reason that I adore these is because you can see in them this same kind of unbridled enthusiasm, passion, and admiration that you heard from him and saw from him as an 11-year-old. It's an incredible kind of bookend to thinking about, Mud Runner is, tons of eyes and frenzied mark making, which is what it must feel like to be on the hot track at that speed. The kind of quickness of the experience, the ability to have to respond, and this exuberance in the way that he was making this work, I think holds that same key to the, again, this sort of deep, heroic, almost worship of what it would mean to try to control one of these machines. So I'd like to just end with a piece of something that Sal had written. And I think this really puts, again, quite a fine point on his understanding of where he stood in the art world and why these two things were for him so truly parallel and so inextricably linked. It's called "The Race Is Mine." Racing is a passion for me. It has always been that way, ever since I was a very young boy. I look at painting and sculpture in the same way I look at racing. So, for me, it is art and racing, racing and art. Racing gloves, I've never worn them. Slow drawing about fast things can be fast drawings about static things. My goggles are already fogged up. I must be in the art world. These are racers. There are racers who like the dirt, and there are racers who like the high banks, made out of asphalt or cement. It's just like in the art world. There are those who run the dirt, and there are those who run the high banks. The high banks are cleaner, but the dirt is more truthful, more exciting, more dangerous, and it involves a lot of people. They're really looking at their own house dirt. Those tracks run straight through the backyards of America. These race on dirt. So like artists, sometimes they have to cover their mouths. Funny, when you get into a race car for the first time, you're sitting in there and you're looking at the dashboard and you're looking down the hood, looking way down beyond the hood to that empty track. You start hearing the engines of the other cars next to you. You know that any second you're going to start your own car, so you're getting ready. You gotta get going now. Now is the time to get going. Holding on to the wheel for a racer is like an artist holding on to an idea. You've got to hold it, you've got to steady it, but you've got to relax. The car is going all the time. If there's an accident, you've got to hold on to the wheel, because if you let go, your arms go up in the air, and then, you're flying. Thank you. So I think the galleries are open and you are welcome to go and take a peek. The one last thing I'll say very quickly is that it was extraordinarily wonderful and generous to have the lenders that we have had. There are so many works in this exhibition that have never been seen in a public setting, that have never been seen in a museum, that have never been seen, period. And it's very special. Stella Scarpitta, Sal's daughter, told me that for many, many, many years, he just kept saying, "Stella, I want a car show." Well, I'm sorry it's posthumous, but he got one. Take care.